Let's read God's word together from Esther, the first chapter, beginning in verse 1. This is what happened during the time of Xerxes, the Xerxes who ruled over 127 provinces, stretching from India to Cush. At that time, King Xerxes reigned from his royal throne in the citadel of Susa. And in the 3rd year of his reign, he gave a banquet for all his nobles and officials. The military leaders of Persia and Media, the first princes, and the nobles of the provinces were present. For a full 180 days he displayed the vast wealth of his kingdom and the splendor and glory of his majesty. When these days were over, the king gave a banquet lasting 7 days in the enclosed garden of the king's palace for all the people from the least to the greatest who were in the citadel of Susa. The garden had hangings of white and blue linen, fastened with cords of white linen and purple material, 2 silver rings on marble pillars. There were couches of gold and silver on a mosaic pavement of porphyry, marble, mother of pearl, and other costly stones. Wine was served in goblets of gold, each one different from the other, and the royal wine was abundant, in keeping with the king's liberality. By the king's command, each guest was allowed to drink with no restrictions, for the king instructed all the wine stewards to serve each man what he wished. Queen Vashti also gave a banquet for the women in the royal palace of King Xerxes. On the 7th day, when the king was in high spirits from wine, he commanded the 7 eunuchs who served him, Mehuman, Biztha, Harbona, Bigtha, Abagtha, Zethar, and Carcass, to bring Queen Vashti wearing her royal crown in order to display her beauty to the people and nobles, for she was lovely to look at. But when the attendants delivered the king's command, Queen Vashti refused to come. Then the king became furious and burned with anger. Since it was customary for the king to consult experts in matters of law and justice, he spoke with the wise men who understood the times and were closest to the king: Karshena, Shethar, Admatha, Tarshish, Meres, Marsena, and Memcan, the 7 nobles of Persia and Media who had special access to the king and were highest in the kingdom. According to the law, what must be done to Queen Vashti, he asked. She has not obeyed the command of King Xerxes that the eunuchs have taken to her. Then Memucan replied in the presence of the king and the nobles, Queen Vashti has done wrong, not only against the king, but also against all the nobles and the peoples of all the provinces of King Xerxes. For the queen's conduct will become known to all women, and so they will despise their husbands and say, King Xerxes commanded Queen Vashti be brought before him, but she would not come. This very day, the Persian and Median women of the nobility who had heard about the queen's conduct will respond to all the king's nobles in the same way. There will be no end of disrespect and discord. Therefore, if it pleases the king, let him issue a royal decree and let it be written in the laws of Persia and Media, which cannot be repealed, that Vashti is never again to enter the presence of King Xerxes. Also let the king give her royal position to someone else who is better than she is. Then when the king's edict is proclaimed throughout all his vast realm, all the women will respect their husbands from the least to the greatest. The kings and nobles were pleased with his advice, so the king did as Memucan proposed. He sent dispatches to all parts of the kingdom, to each province in its own script, and to each people in their own language, proclaiming that every man should be ruler over his household, using his native tongue. The grass withers, the flowers fade, but the word of the Lord endures forever. Friends, this is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God.
Well, good morning. As promised, the back half of our service will look a little bit different this morning. We're joined by Charles Lewis and Sarah Lewis Canoe, who are Lance's children, both serve as pastors, and also by Margaret Ferguson and Steve Rowe, who did a bang-up job pronouncing all those Persian names. Great job. They're members of our larger denominational body and are really just delightful people to get to know. We're part of the Evangelical Presbyterian Church, and if that word seems weird to you, Presbyterian, it simply means elder. It describes kind of how we operate. And elder, not so much in the sense of age, but elder in the sense of maturity and wisdom. So we are a church led by men and women chosen by members of the congregation who abide in Jesus and who make sure that our priorities, our policies, our values reflect the heart of God to our church and to our city. And we're here to celebrate and install Lance Lewis as our pastor for mission and formation. Installation is a service in which we celebrate a providential God who calls and equips leaders. And it's a service in which we remind Lance what it means to be called to serve, and where we are reminded ourselves of what it means to receive his leadership and his authority. So thank you, Margaret. Thank you, Steve. Thank you, Charles. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you for all being here and for reminding us that we don't do this alone. We're also beginning a series of messages on the book of Esther. It's a book in which the subject of God's providence is front and center. And it's a story that has occupied a really unique place in the biblical canon. For the first 7 centuries of the church's life, not a single commentary was written on this story. John Calvin, the forebear of the Reformed faith, who preached and wrote nearly every single day for 30 years, did not once make a reference to the Persian Hebrew heroine. His fellow reformer, Martin Luther, actually went so far as to say that he was so great an enemy to Esther that he wished it had not been written at all, which just adds him to my list of historical figures that would have done well as internet trolls. But the hesitancy over this book isn't really so much about what it contains, but what it is missing. Famously, God is never mentioned. Biblical scholar Karen Jobe sums up the controversy like this. Other than the fact that the story is about the Jewish people, there's nothing Jewish about it in the religious sense. It contains neither the divine name Yahweh nor Elohim, the Hebrew noun meaning God. Although the events it records take place after the decree of Cyrus in 529 BC, which allowed the Jews to return to Jerusalem from exile in Babylonia, there's no mention of Jerusalem or the temple. Unlike the book of Daniel, which is also set in the court of a pagan king, no one prays in the book of Esther. No one has an apocalyptic vision in the Hebrew book of Esther. There's no apparent concern for the law. And in this book, there is not even one tiny miracle. And so with a book and a story that seems to be set in a world in which God, visions, the miraculous, the supernatural, all appear to be locked out, what does it have to say, possibly to a church who believes that God is holy and present? Well, I think for many of us, the book of Esther echoes something of the tension that we regularly live with. In the global West, we live and we experience the world through what the philosopher Charles Taylor calls the immanent frame. And what he means by that is if you were to think of reality as containing a box, and inside the box is everything observable, all the sensory experience, everything immanent, everything that you can see, taste, touch, hear, smell. We tend to operate that inside that box is all there is to reality. Everything that fits in the box is all there is. And that world operates a little bit like a machine that, maybe, there was a God somewhere in it, but everything else is driven by historically explainable forces, whether economics or politics or psychology or race or gender or sociology or biology. And if there is a God outside of that box somewhere, he just wound the machine up and let it do what it does. Ours, in other words, is a secular age. And one way of kind of understanding the complexity and the anxiety of living in a secular age is that we've gotten really good at tracing cause and effect and really bad at understanding why any of it has any meaning whatsoever. But other cultures and other time periods would view the world as that box with one layer inside of another layer, and they would see that box as porous. Go ahead and move to the next slide. Things outside that box contain the spiritual world. It's available to be influenced and to break into a transcendent reality that surrounds and undergirds the box. And this is the life of the tension that we face in a post-Christian world. It's where most of us live most of the time. We have a set of practices that allow us to draw near to God, to abide in God, to receive from His life, from the triune life of God, our own sense of life and nourishment by the Spirit. But most of our transformation that happens in our spiritual lives happens beneath the level of our awareness. And so we experience large seasons of life with nothing out of the ordinary, with nothing obviously divine breaking into our frame of view. And so we ask the same questions that occupy the book of Esther. Where is God in the midst of all my suffering? If God is real and present, why does it feel like all my prayers are left unread? For people in exile, those questions took a very particular shape. Where is God, and how do we worship God when everything that was visible about God, the temple, the sacrificial system, the holy city, the priesthood, all of that is a distant memory? Are we even still God's people, and will God still preserve us? Maybe more to the point, can we even trust this God when all the world around us seems to be moving along just fine without obvious signs of His presence? But I want to suggest that it's from this place of hiddenness that the book of Esther actually has a lot to say. It's where God speaks most clearly through the pages of this story. And that's what makes it so helpful for us. Within the library of Scripture, we see a broad range of God's involvement. In the story of the Exodus, for instance, God is present with an outstretched hand. He's parting the Red Sea. He's guiding the people with a cloud by day and with a pillar of fire by night. He's providing manna in the wilderness. He's putting His words onto stone tablets. Similarly, God is present in the book of Joseph, working everything for good when his brothers meant it for evil. The miraculous is in full display in the book of Daniel. God shows up, staying the mouths of lions and appearing within a blazing furnace and handwriting across a wall. And then we got Esther on the complete other end of the continuum. God is off stage. God is out of view, directing things in a way that can only be seen through the eyes of faith. His theology is under the surface of things. And in a world in which everything can look like a sawtooth of injustice and fate, Esther makes the claim that there is a providential hand bending things toward their appointed ends, and this too is grace. It means that we can trust in a God who is active and present when our prayer life is not. It means that we can trust in a God who is faithful when we are not. And like any good storyteller, the writer of Esther unpacks this conviction with a lot of literary skill. The ethicist Stanley Hauerwas writes, "A people are formed by a story which places their history in the texture of the world. And nowhere is this more true than in the book of Esther." See, because while God's name is never mentioned, there are all sorts of coincidences that happen throughout the story, all sorts of ironic twists that come at just the right moment. And so we don't come to this book as we would expecting to come to like a newspaper from ancient Persia. Instead, we come to it as a theological interpretation of events that show the meaning behind the story. A story in which God's people are threatened and delivered, where providence doesn't work itself out with burning bushes and angelic visitations, but instead through ordinary grit and courage and determination and an invisible hand that seems to bend things at just the right moment. And I think that's the same role that the Spirit plays in our stories as well. Rarely do we understand the true significance of the events in our lives as they are happening to us. It's only when we look back that we see the hand of a God who is leading us into deeper faith and trust in Him. And so the author takes a lot of poetic license. At one point, turning toward the satirical, another point turning toward the melodramatic, all to draw the reader in onto a little secret. And names are part of this technique. For example, the name Vashti is very similar to the Persian word for beautiful woman or beloved. The king's name, when said in Persian, means hero among men, but when pronounced in Hebrew, sounds like king headache. Haman is similar to the Hebrew word meaning wrath. And even the name Esther is part of this. She actually has two names in the story. Hadassah in Hebrew being myrtle, which is a Hebrew symbol of life, which is exactly what she secures for her people. And then later, Esther is renamed to the Persian Esther, which is like Ishtar, the goddess of love and war, two matters in which Esther has a lot to say. But when we read the name Esther in Hebrew, that's when it gets really interesting. It's rendered, I am hidden. And this is more than just clever wordplay. It's a really subversive way of telling the story. As the drama plays out, hiddenness is a major theme. Bodies are hidden. Identities, intentions, all stay hidden throughout, as does the God behind and beneath the story. And the rabbis link to this hiddenness to Deuteronomy 31, where God tells his people, surely I will hide my face from you, in response to the people's disobedience which led them to their exile. But the promise of the story is that while God may hide his face, God refuses to abandon his people. So with all that stuff swirling around in the background, Esther seeks to answer this question. How do the people of God navigate life and faith in the contested space of a hostile culture in which their ways of being and their faith is not welcome? Can this God, whose presence is veiled, be trusted when the only way forward seems to be either assimilation to the surrounding culture or futile resistance to that culture? And I would suggest those are the exact same questions for us. So we jump into a story that unfolds like this. This is what happened during the time of Xerxes. Sounds a little bit like Once Upon a Time. But it's actually a way of locating the story in history. And some of your Bibles will say the name Ahasuerus is the name of the Persian king. That's the Persian name. Ahashweroth in Hebrew. Xerxes is how it's rendered in Greek. All you need to know is it's the same dude. All those names, same guy. The fourth king of the Persian Empire, who reigned over lands that stretched from northern Africa all the way to India. This is a map for those of you who like to connect the historical dots. You can see Judea, Israel off to the side to the Mediterranean Sea, and then Susa is the capital in which all of the action takes place, a little red dot in the center. And it's actually a place that was known for its elaborate palace. The Greek historian Herodotus confirms that Xerxes was known for his lavish parties, including a 6-month military conference that took place during the 3rd year of his reign, right when this story is set. He also gives us this little curious historic detail that Persian military leaders made absolutely no decisions without excessive drinking. Which, all right. So after this 6-month-long frat party, he follows it up with a 7-day party for everyone in the empire, including the Jews, meaning that if they don't make waves, Susa actually might not be that bad. So we're meant to see that this is a king who owns and controls all the world that matters. And so we've got all these, various descriptions of the linen, the things that are hanging in the palace garden, the plush couches, the marble, the porphyry, the mother of pearl, the golden goblets. And as it is, the only other garden described in the Bible with as much detail is named Eden. The only other building given as much attention throughout the Bible is the temple in Jerusalem. So here we have the dream of heaven and the realities of earth taking place in the exact same moment. If there is a God among men, his name is Xerxes. If there is a heaven, it has a rival in Susa. It's got a paradise-like garden. It's got a feast that never ends, where even the least can drink from a golden cup. Everything you need to know about how things are and how things always will be right here in this introduction. How's that as a setup for an opening act? But if this is a God among men, what happens when his law is broken? Well, for the final act of his display of greatness, Xerxes summons his wife for all of his officers to ogle at. And she says, nah. Pulling the rug out from under him, embarrassing him in front of all his bros. And so one woman's bold decision sets the entire action of this story in motion. Humiliated, Xerxes gathers his cabinet and goes into full damage control mode. The spin room is at high operation. And what follows is what I can only describe as, have you ever been part of a group project where everyone shows up and somehow the final result is stupider than like any one person in the room? Like, that's what happens here. And they give the kind of advice that you might expect after 187 days of straight drinking, right? They're like, we got an idea. We'll play this out. But this is actually where the facade of Xerxes' unlimited power starts to crack. And it's where the artistry of the storyteller starts to shine through a bit. Every year at the Festival of Purim, Jews around the world read Esther in its entirety, and they interact with the story like you would at a melodrama, laughing and booing and cheering as people act out the events of the story. And this first scene gives us an opportunity to be in on the joke. Think about it. The advisors and the king, they don't want anyone to know that the queen has disrespected him, right? Moreover, they are fearful of what will happen, in the sexual politics of the kingdom if word gets out. The queen said, no, what will happen if all the women in the empire hear about this? It will be chaos. That was a great laugh. Thank you, Bonte. So they decide that the best way to keep all this stuff on the down low is to take this personal slight and turn it into a crisis of state, to enshrine it in law and then send it to every household in the empire. And as punishment for refusing to see the king, the queen does not have to see the king. And so what we're meant to see is the absolute foolishness of imperial power. If respect has to be commanded and loyalty pledged, it has absolutely no meaning whatsoever. If the king claims to have great power, and yet here he is powerless to convince his queen to come to a party. He gives firm and irrevocable laws, yet his laws are absolutely ridiculous. And he's too foolish to think for himself. He's too proud to see that he is so easily manipulated. And if the emperor has no clothes, what does that say about his empire? Notably, all of this takes place before the first Hebrew character comes on the scene. So suddenly this empire that seems so impressive in the opening scene is shown to be a dim parody of the king that the prophets say is coming. Xerxes holds tremendous power, but he uses it to magnify himself without much concern for other people. And what happens when people who are controlled by their fears and their anxieties start to abuse the power that they've been given? And Vashti, for her part, is far more than just a humorous plot device. She may be queen, but she is still a woman navigating a patriarchal culture with very limited options. And it's not hard to admire her courage even when you acknowledge what it cost. But her no sets the stage for Esther. And she does so by showing what far too many throughout history have experienced when faced with an oppressive system, whether that be one based on race or class or sex. Those who resist the powers that be are often cast aside and have no more ability to influence. So what does faithfulness look like for those with limited power? For people in exile, Eden is long gone. The temple has been destroyed. The signs and the symbols of the promise. Everything is a distant memory. They had been chosen by God. They had been loved by God. They had been sent by God to bring the news of his love to the nations, to the world. And now God was silent, or at least seemed a long way off. But you could hear the sound of those parties coming down the mountainside from Susa. And maybe you could even get an invitation to one of those parties. And would that be that bad? I mean, God seems to be in hiding, but the political power of Persia is pretty obvious. And when we look up to heaven, the people wonder, all we see is the shadow of the palace. And so while God is never mentioned, this interplay of the futility of human power raises the question, well, where does power ultimately come from? And I think those might be the same questions that we have when we look at the opulence, when we look at the injustice, when we look at the abusive systems of power in our world. Where is God in the midst of the pain and brokenness of our history? And if he's just hiding, then maybe the world's power is good enough. That's the temptation. Suddenly, Esther is a story that places our history in the texture of the world as well. Because it's one thing to remain faithful to God when all of the cultural winds are at your back. It's another thing to remain faithful in a context that insists that if there is a God, he is hidden at best and completely irrelevant at worst. And one temptation may be deny that there is any tension and just join in on the party. Another temptation might be to run after any means of power you can find, political clout, or a kind of prestige, or simply the numbing power of excess. All those things will be appealing if you sense God's distance. But all those things turn out to be a pretty poor substitute. Sociologist James Davison Hunter puts it like this: all social organizations exist as parodies of eschatological, just another fancy word for ultimate hope. And so it is the city that is a poor imitation of the heavenly community, the modern state a deformed version of the ecclesia, the church. The market, a distortion of consummation. Modern entertainment, a caricature of joy. Schooling, a misrepresentation of true formation. Liberalism, a crass simulacrum of freedom. And the sovereignty we afford to the self, a parody of God himself. As these institutions and ideals become ends in themselves, they become the objects of idolatry. The shalom of God, which is to say the presence of God himself, is the antithesis to all such imitations. Friends, what we crave is the nearness of God, but when we sense that missing, we will grab for anything to fill the void. Maybe you've heard that this is an election year. How's that for a transition? It's going to be really easy to get caught up in campaigns and candidates who will increasingly cast their bids for power in apocalyptic terms. And while I don't think that anyone has planned a 6-month party, no doubt promises will be made. And as faith has receded, politics has become a kind of religion. It becomes a place where we look for meaning. News reporting is framed in terms of which side is winning, which side is losing, in the context for political advantage, as though that is the only game in town. And when political language starts to shape the imagination, grabs for power become the ways that we think change has to happen. And so it may be very tempting to assume that in the absence of divine presence, the best way forward is to cast your lot with the powers that be and try to just grab a little bit of that power for ourselves. Even if that power means giving ground to a kingdom that cannot deliver on its promises, much less transform the human heart. The way of Jesus is radically different. Before the cross, Jesus tells his disciples, "You know that those who are regarded as rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their high officials exercise authority over them. Not so with you. Instead, whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant." And as we will see, that is what is at the heart of Esther. That's the example she sets. She becomes the Christ figure of this story by not seeing power as something to use to her own advantage, but by laying it down for the sake of her people. So what does faithfulness look like in the contested space of our own culture? Like 6th century exiles, we're asking the question, where's power? Where's the real king? And the way that we answer that question shapes our lives and our stories in a pretty profound way. One of the central questions of Esther is, how do we remain faithful when the way forward is not clear? When the nearness and the availability of God, when the signs of his active presence are pretty hard to come by? When all the markers of our cultural life no longer automatically point in his direction? Do we throw our lot in with the empire and trust that its vision of goodness and the luxury and comfort that it provides is going to be good enough? Or do we completely resist and get tossed to the sidelines? And one would like to think that the answers are always clear, that from the moment that the Spirit came at Pentecost to the moment that the heavenly city will come down, that the way of the church is just a clear path forward. But it's not always like that. Esther says, it was never like that. N.T. Wright says that being a Christian is a bit like being in the audience of a play that has followed along with the script in our hands for the first 4 acts. And we're given a little bit of an epilogue as to how the story is going to end, but then all of a sudden we get thrust into the play in the middle of the 5th act and are told, act in a way that makes sense of the end of the story, but you're given no script. The only choice is to improvise. You know what came before? You've got the Holy Spirit. You know where the story is heading. It started in the garden with God and humans together. It's ending in a garden-like city where the God who we've experienced through a veiled face will be known in his fullness. So how do we live in a way that's faithful to that story? Both where it started and where it's going. Well, here are the lessons of Esther. Don't despair. Make provision. Develop practices. Let those who seek power for their own ends fall to their own ambition while you fall back on your faith. Trust in the God who is hidden yet present. And the challenge for us is that we do that amid 1,000 different stories, each clamoring for their time on stage. The invitation is to trust that we have a king and a kingdom in Jesus. And he has not stayed hidden. He has come. He has broken into the world to be with us. Salvation has come. Salvation is coming. Now, Lance, as we celebrate your installation today, we bear witness to a God whose providence seldom sets itself on a clear path. Did you have any idea a year ago that you would be sitting right there? We did not either. And yet the events that brought you here have, from the beginning to the end, had that familiar mark of a God whose providential hand is just moving things along. So we're so grateful for you and for sharing. We have every confidence that you will help us be better storytellers here in Decatur of what God is up to in this world. We have every confidence you're going to help us live out our story with deeper hope and deeper faith. Challenges are real. City can sometimes feel like a pretty unfriendly place to those who believe that our faith has something public to offer. But you're here to help us build a web of stubbornly loyal relationships, held together by people who are committed to practicing the way of Jesus for the renewal of all things. And we are grateful for all the ways that God has equipped you, all the ways that he has made you so that you can help us tell the story more faithfully so that we can live the story more fully. And there are times when you will falter and you will need us to hold you up. There are times when we will falter and you will need to kick us in the pants. But we're grateful for the wisdom of the God who brought you here. And if in those moments when you begin to wonder why, which they will come, and maybe even question God and ask, what were you thinking? May the words that we hear later in Esther's story be words spoken to you. Who knows, but that you've come into your position for such a time as this. May it be so.